Thank you all very, very much for being here tonight. My job is to introduce David Dangremond, after whom this lecture is named. But before I do, I want to draw your attention to a variety of really fantastic programs coming up in the next few weeks here at Rosecliff. We have a phenomenal fellows program, and our fellows are finishing their first year of research and study. And on the 30th of July, two fellows, Ben Bowery and Eve Loftus, will be sharing new discoveries of the work of the renowned Gilded Age designer Jules Lard. And on the 8th of August, we will hear from Donnie Zhang, who has carefully researched our Chinese art collection and has really taught us a lot of new information about that collection. And we will also hear from Isla Stewart, who has been researching animals during the Gilded Age. I know that sounds like an odd topic, but we have an exhibition show opening up at the end of August called Wild Imagination. And what it does is talk about the changing attitudes of pets and animals. And somebody had to do the research, so Isla did it for us. Finally, we cap off our summer with the John G. Winslow Lecture on the 8th of August, and our speaker will be Dr. Philip Rylands. Dr. Rylands is the president and CEO of the Society of Four Arts in Palm Beach. Before becoming the CEO and president of the Four Arts, he was the director of the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, and he will be sharing the fascinating collecting philosophy of Peggy Guggenheim, who is a real character, and I know this is going to be a lot of fun. So if you are interested in any of those lectures, go to newportmansions.org and you can learn more. Now, David will be formally introducing Ian, but because, as you all know, Ian has announced his retirement sometime in October or November or December or January, whenever the building is finished, I do not want to miss the opportunity of publicly recognizing this incredible museum professional. He is such a very good friend of mine. I have great respect and admiration for you, Ian, and it has really been an honor to work with you over many, many years. Two incidents that I want to share with you. I was at a dinner 13 years ago. We were at David Ford's house. David Ford is a former trustee of the Preservation Society who has unfortunately died, and he was then the owner of Miramar. And we were very, very nice dinner, and the guest of honor was going to be Ian and his wife. Not one of us knew until we sat down at dinner that afternoon, Ian had been offered the job to be the director of the Frick. So you can imagine how much celebration there was that night. I think he was more surprised than anybody. And then a second, as you probably know from reading the papers, there's been a lot of controversy about the new Frick. Ian has persevered, he has changed plans, he has pivoted, he's done all the words that you know. He has never given up. And within the next few months, his vision of a new Frick will be realized. Well, at the same time that Ian was going through his battles, we were having a few battles here in Newport over a little tiny building called the Welcome Center. And I can honestly tell you that my only friend in the world, the only person on this planet who really understood exactly what I was going through was Ian Wardropper. So he was a wonderful counselor and listening board, and wow, am I very lucky to have had you at my side. To pay tribute to this outstanding man, there are a number of museum directors or professionals here, and I want to acknowledge them all because I think it's a tribute to you. But first, one of Ian's bosses, a trustee of the Frick, Chuck Royce, is here. Thank you very much for being here. We have two representatives, leaders from the Historical Society, Becca Bertrand, the executive director, and Bert Lippincott, the historian. Danielle Ogden is here from the Newport Art Museum. Reagan Miner from Ford Adams Trust is here. David DeMuzio, who's the director of the Audrain Auto Museum. Arthur Wheelock, who is the head of the Leiden Collection in New York. We have Anne Swinburne, the head of Hillstead Museum in the Hartford area. We have many people from the Wadsworth Atheneum, including David Dangremond, Brenton Grom from the Webb Dean Stevens Museum, and finally, last but not least, Belinda Keeland, who is the chairman of the board of the Independent Curators International. So we've got a really hefty group of professionals here because of you. Finally, it is really my great honor to introduce David Dangremond, who has a long history with the Preservation Society, 35 years. He was the founding member of the Newport Symposium in 1993. He still sits on the symposium committee as a very valuable participant. He's had an illustrious career in the museum world, including the renovation of the Wadsworth Atheneum. He was a professor of art history at Trinity College, and he has been associated for years, and he will tell you about that because he brags about all of these institutions: Historic Deerfield, Winter Tour, the Addingham School Program. His connections are as strong today as they were 20 years ago. He really knows everyone in the field, so we are very grateful to have him on our team, part of the Preservation Society, and I want to ask you to please join me in welcoming David to the podium. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, and thank you, Trudy. Heartfelt thanks for that very generous introduction. It's not I, but rather our illustrious speaker who I have the privilege of introducing tonight. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second in this summer lecture series of the Preservation Society. What a perfect night to be here in the newly restored ballroom of Rosecliff. Newport is no stranger to the extensive and painstaking restoration of large private houses built at the turn of the century, the 20th century, and recent efforts by both the Preservation Society and private owners have brought leading architects, engineers, and curators to Newport to ensure the long-term preservation and accurate restoration of the exteriors, interiors, and gardens of our collection of world-renowned houses of the late 19th and early 20th century, which provide a three-dimensional textbook of that opulent era of grand private houses, the so-called Gilded Age. Many of the most prominent New Yorkers of the period escaped the heat, noise, and dirt of the city for more secluded summer oases, from the Berkshires to Bar Harbor, but none was more fashionable than Newport. Although the key figure in this evening's lecture, Henry Clay Frick, was not among those who chose Newport, he did commission a magnificent 104-room waterfront retreat called Eagle Rock in Pride's Crossing on the North Shore of Boston, designed in Georgian Revival style by Boston architects Little and Brown in 1904. When completed in 1906, the house was described as, quote, the grandest mansion north of Newport. But tonight, the subject of our talk is the far better known New York City house of Henry Clay Frick, the elegant Fifth Avenue mansion designed in 1913 by noted Beaux-Arts architects Carrère and Hastings. Frick specified that the house should be, quote, in good taste, not ostentatious. The architects certainly succeeded, and Frick, already an avid collector, set about furnishing his interiors with his impressive collections of art and decorative arts. When completed in 1915, Architecture magazine did call the Frick House, quote, the most costly and sumptuous house in America. Frick died in 1919, but following the death of his wife, Adelaide, in 1931, the house and its collections were open to the public, and the Frick collection has remained an internationally acclaimed and much beloved museum ever since. Over the past 10 years, the Frick collection has been undergoing its first major renewal in 90 years. Tonight, we are extremely privileged to have the man who has overseen the museum, its collections, and its massive renovation and expansion with us to share his insider's perspective on the painstaking process, along with a preview of the eagerly anticipated unveiling of the extraordinary results later this year. And I'm sure everyone in this room is going to make a pilgrimage to Fifth Avenue to see the results. Ian Wardropper has served as the Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen director of the Frick Collection since the fall of 2011, following that wonderful dinner just down the road at Miramar. After completing his PhD at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, he was curator and later head of the Department of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture and Ancient Art at the Art Institute of Chicago for 19 years, until returning to New York in 2001 as the Iris and B. Gerald Cantor Chairman of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He has organized more than 20 exhibitions in his specialties of European sculpture, early decorative arts, and 20th century design and decorative arts. He has taught art history at 6 universities and published numerous books, catalogs, and articles. His most recent publications include European Sculpture, 1400 to 1900 in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Bernini, Sculpting in Clay, and Limoges Enamels at the Frick Collection. And not surprisingly, he has 2 forthcoming publications, both focused on the Frick and its collections, so stay tuned. Ian is a longtime friend of the Preservation Society of Newport, as Trudy has already noted, and many of you here tonight will remember him as a revered speaker at our Newport Symposium, and more recently, his most recent lecture for the Preservation Society in 2017 on Henry Clay Frick as a collector. I suspect Dr. Wardropper first visited Newport while an undergraduate nearby at Brown University, or maybe it was when you were 5 years old. Who knows? He went on to complete his PhD at the prestigious Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, no doubt spending countless hours of study and contemplation at the Frick Collection, which is conveniently located just 7 blocks south of the Institute. How fortuitous for the Frick that fate brought him back in 2011 to guide its impressive path into the 21st century. Dr. Wardropper recently said, "These 14 years at the Frick will have been among the most rewarding of my career. From the first strategic plan developed together with the Frick's dedicated trustees and talented staff, we identified our aspirations and priorities and committed to the values and programs that make the Frick unique. It has been a great privilege to realize these initiatives during my tenure, the reopening of our upgraded buildings being a highlight among many." Tonight, he will share his insights on those aspirations and priorities, all guided by his masterful orchestration of their realization in his lecture titled simply, "The Frick Renewed." Ian.
Thank you, David, for an eloquent introduction, and I'm honored to be part of this lecture series that you support and compliment you on all the many other things that you do to support the world of arts and architecture and decorative arts. And I'm happy to be here with Trudy. As she says, we belong to an obscure little group called the Gilded Age Museum Directors, and we meet periodically and try to help each other. So we've been through a lot together. It's great to be back here. And I do remember being in Miramar. One of the things I remember particularly was when my wife and I were in an upstairs bedroom and next to the issue of Gardens and Gun was also a map of the floor in case we got lost at night. So it's not that large a house, but I do remember it being very impressive. So today I am going to talk about Henry Clay Frick, beginning with his houses, several of the houses that he had and that led to him becoming a collector. I'm going to talk a bit about the many attempts that the Frick has had to expand over the years, and then bring you up to date with where we are today. I hope many of you know the Frick, in many ways a kind of perfect marriage of one of the greatest collections of old master art in the world with a very distinguished house in New York of the early 20th century. And the Living Hall is kind of the emblem of it in many ways. It has hardly ever changed since it was installed by Henry, with paintings by Holbein and El Greco, Near Eastern carpets, French 18th century furniture, Chinese porcelain, Italian bronzes, very much a mix that expresses the kind of aspirations of collectors of the day, and is the quality of the Frick. It's a very intimate place. It's a place that you feel at home in, or you can. It's not a conventional museum, and this has been very much what we have aimed to preserve while adding what the Frick needs in order to continue in the future. So Henry was born in 1849, West Overton, Pennsylvania. It's about a 2-hour drive today from Pittsburgh. This was the family house. His father was a Swiss-German Mennonite farmer. His mother's family was actually quite prosperous. They owned a distillery that still produces Old Overholt rye whiskey today, and one of Henry's first jobs was as an accountant for the distillery. But his his breakthrough really came with recognizing the importance of coke to the burgeoning iron and steel industry. So coke is coal that's been baked and allows the iron and or steel smelting to achieve very high temperatures. And he had a cousin named Tinsman who owned coal lands. Henry went into partnership with his cousin and 2 others, and very quickly bought them out. Within 10 years, he had a monopoly of 80% of coke in the United States. He became a very wealthy man very quickly through his industry and his vision. He also, endearingly, was interested in art from an early age. There's an anecdote that's never been verified in the archives, but rings true nonetheless, that the Mellon Bank sent an industry representative to Henry when he was trying to expand and wanted a loan. And the report came back that he may be a little too interested in pictures, but not enough to hurt. So we don't know what was on the walls of the office of the coking factories at that point. Probably they were reproductions of paintings, which were circulating widely in America beginning in 1846. Goupil and Company was circulating such things around the country. It's probably what Henry had on his walls. But this is the first documented painting we know that he bought, where you see the document on the left, drawn on Mellon's Bank, going to Monongahela House, which is the hotel in Pittsburgh at the time, and by a local artist named George Hetzel. So how did Henry get interested in collecting? And it must be said, first and foremost, it was through artists. He was very friendly with an artist named Joseph Woodwell, for example. David mentioned the house called Eagle Rock near Gloucester, Massachusetts. And it was Woodwell and his wife who brought Henry and Adelaide there in the first place. They summered with them, and that's when the Fricks first grew to love the beauty of that area and led them to build where they were. But so it was artists like Joseph Woodwell, dealers, trips to Europe with his best friend Andrew Mellon, local collectors. The Carnegie International starts in 1896. Frick begins to collect. So there, he sees collectors, he's learning from artists, he's learning from dealers. But it's important to remember that Henry, for the first 25 years of his career, he's essentially collecting contemporary art. It's not until he moves to New York that he really makes the switch to old masters. And he begins to collect Barbizon School. It's through people like Woodwell, this American artist who is writing and lecturing, that Henry begins to take an interest in French art. So this is a Corot painting that he buys actually later on in 1906. Henry marries Adelaide Childs in 1882. They have 4 children altogether. You see Childs on the left, and then Childs and Helen Clay and Martha. Martha sadly dies young, age 6, and Henry Clay Frick II dies in infancy. The death of their children really affected them greatly. And it was the growing family that leads him to buy a property in Point Breeze, a suburb of Pittsburgh, which he remodels, and then remodels again, which is what you're seeing here of remodeling from about 1892 that was done by an architect named Osterling. Osterling was the architect, the society architect, essentially, of Pittsburgh of this day. And Pittsburgh was such a dynamic city with people like Henry Heinz, George Washington, who am I thinking of? Westinghouse. Some of the great American companies were being formed in the 1880s, 1890s, and Osterling is doing houses for them, and he remodels Clayton, as the house is called. And here you see the dining room. It's been recently beautifully refurbished from 1892. Aesthetic movement, but very much with a unity of concept in which the leather wall hangings, stained glass windows, wood carving are all brought together alongside furniture that comes from Kimball on the East Coast, Gorham and Tiffany silver, English porcelain in the sideboards. No room here really for paintings, as you can see, but he had become a considerable collector by this time, and you can kind of get a sense from this. This is actually a photograph from 1901 of the reception hall, where paintings are beginning to crowd out everything in the rooms. On either side of the fireplace are Corot and Narcisse Diaz de la Peña. Frick is briefly considering adding an art gallery to this space because he's got so many paintings. He's the biggest collector in Pittsburgh at this point. But the story changes around this time, and I have to go back for a second and get back into the story of his business, which is that Frick becomes the great purveyor of coke, so important to iron and steel that Andrew Carnegie brings the coke business into his iron and steel business. Here you see portraits by a French artist named Théobald Chartrain that Frick commissioned first in 1895 of Carnegie and the portrait of himself in 1896. I love the kind of characterizations of this in which Carnegie is the kind of visionary looking off into the distance, and Frick is the worker bee with his desk spilling over with papers, which was very much their relationship. So over time, Frick, because he was truly a managerial genius, and Carnegie recognized that, Carnegie basically let Frick run the business. He became the chairman. Being a managerial genius at that time also, of course, brought him into conflict with labor unions because Frick was trying to get the most out of his workforce. There was an infamous strike called the Homestead Strike in 1892. 8 lives were lost. Frick took the blame. Carnegie was off in his house in Scotland, and so Frick had to kind of patch things together. He was vilified in the press because of this, and this is really the beginning of a rift between these two men. Frick brings the company back together again. They are one of the most important iron and steel companies. Eventually, the company that is formed through J.P. Morgan into U.S. Steel around 1900. They become tremendously wealthy, but at a certain point, Carnegie pushes Frick off the board. Frick sues, he wins his lawsuit, and it's around this time that he moves from Pittsburgh to New York, staying first in the Sherry Hotel, And then he's offered the grandest house in New York to rent. This is the William Vanderbilt house, then on the corner of 51st and 5th. It was called the Triple Palace because it was built for Vanderbilt and his two daughters. It was a house that Edith Wharton, arbiter of taste, condemned the interiors of as being the Thermopylae of bad taste, referencing an ancient disastrous naval battle. But it was a house that Frick aspired to. When he was a young man, he and Andrew Mellon came to New York in 1880, and they saw the house under construction. And so when Frick had the opportunity to rent this house for $50,000 a year, it was a lot of money in 1905, he did. And one of the things that had also drawn him to the house was its collection, which was in many ways the most famous in America at the time. There had been a book of 10 volumes actually published by the pen name of under Edward Strahan, and Frick had bought some of the volumes. He had bought engravings after Vanderbilt's collection, which were printed on satin, which he had in his house in Clayton. And Vanderbilt's collection was essentially Barbizon School, artists like Gérôme and Meissonier. And so this is what Frick was aspiring to, but it was just also at this moment that he was beginning to shift his ground to collect old master paintings. And he becomes a rival of the great collectors on the East Coast, like Isabella Stewart Gardner or J.P. Morgan, Huntington, Altman, Johnson, the great lawyer in Pittsburgh. Frick has a lot of money. He's been collecting for 25 years. He knows what he's doing, but he shifts from contemporary art to old master, and he's buying at the highest level of the market. And as David mentioned earlier, he also builds a house not too far from here, which is called Eagle Rock. It's a 104-room house. It's now largely been torn down since the 1960s. There are parts of it that remain. And he begins decorating it. Fairly quickly, he gets to the famous dealer, Joseph Duveen, who begins selling him large numbers of furniture and paintings. And this is where Frick spends most of his summers. His best things, his best works of art, he tends to keep in New York, but he has some quite good art in Eagle Rock. So he finally builds his dream house, if you will, on Fifth Avenue and 70th, 71st Street by Carrère and Hastings. As David mentioned, there had been another building on the lot by Richard Morris Hunt, actually called the Lenox Library. Frick had to wait until the books from the library were sent down to the new New York Public Library, also built by Carrère and Hastings, until he could build on this. So he had to wait for 5 years and finally builds it between 1912 and 1914. And he actually offers to move the Richard Morris Hunt building into Central Park as the Parks Administration building, but there's a public outcry, so it doesn't happen, so he tears it down. He builds this instead. And what's important about the interiors, I think, is not recognized sufficiently as the role of decorators and dealers. So the downstairs, first floor, was largely the work of Sir Charles Allam, who you see here on probably what were one of many transatlantic visits from England to the United States. He was working for Rockefeller and other people who Frick knew. He had also worked for the Crown at Buckingham Palace. He had just been knighted, Sir Charles Allam, in 1913. So Frick commissions Sir Charles Allam to do much of the decoration on the ground floor, and in which the collection comes first, which you can see really quite clearly here in the library, where the bookcases have all been kept low enough that there's plenty of room for the art to be displayed above. The second floor was largely the work of another decorator, Elsie de Wolf, who has revered in some quarters even today. She wrote this letter to Frick saying something along the lines of, "I know the tricks of a woman's comfort that no mere man, however clever, could ever achieve." And she got the commission. She's a very clever woman herself, as you can imagine. And so she, whereas the downstairs had more of a sort of English 18th century character, the upstairs had a more French character. So this is Adelaide's bedroom, for example. And then the other figure is Joseph Duveen, who I mentioned earlier, who had already come into the picture helping to furnish Eagle Rock. And Duveen really comes in at a moment when Frick is starting to collect decorative arts in a big way. Frick's been collecting paintings, but now he recognizes he needs decorative arts of the same level of quality. So the room that I'm showing you here, The Progress of Love by Fragonard, is a wonderful example of Duveen's cunning, which is, it's a room that was originally painted for Madame du Barry, the Queen's mistress. She rejects it for reasons we're not entirely sure. Fragonard in the Revolution takes them down and fills out the collection for a cousin's house in Grasse in the south of France. Eventually, J.P. Morgan buys it. Eventually, Duveen manages to step in and install this in Frick's house, this series of paintings. And he does it without a profit. He sells it for $1.25 million, the most Frick ever paid for a work of art in his life, but no profit whatsoever. And why it was so cunning is, as he told his colleagues in his firm, if it's a great success, we'll be able to sell everything in the room to it, which he did indeed. So the garniture of Sèvres porcelain, for instance, was $180,000, a huge sum at the time. Duveen had a great role, particularly in the decorative arts for Frick. Frick, this is a posthumous portrait. There's a rather poignant passage in Helen Clay's writings, his daughter, of the week of Frick's death, her finding him here in the West Gallery, looking at his paintings. He very much wanted to share his collection with the public, and his will of 1915 made that clear. So after his sudden death in 1919, the Frick was eventually to become a public domain, and his wife Adelaide continues to live there until her death in 1931, at which time the trustees have to make this into a public museum. And they decide it's not big enough, the original house, so they ask John Russell Pope to make an addition, which you can sort of see in the extension from 71st Street. The lighter portions there are part of the extension, where the West Gallery, our famous largest gallery, has been extended into other rooms. And Pope builds the library, which is one of the great art reference, art research libraries in the world. So the building opens to the public in 1935. Now I'm looking at it from 70th Street, and this is a photograph. Those of you who know your cars can probably date it, but it's to the 1940s. And first of all, you'll see that the mansion was right up against a row of very large townhouses. But you'll also see, if you look a little further down the street, there's a gap. So this dates after 1941, which is when the Frick buys the first of those 3 townhouses, with the aim eventually of buying them all, taking them down, and building a wing to supply its needs. Because even within 5 years of opening, the Frick, many museums have this problem. They underbuild or they are overly ambitious. And so the Frick recognized within 5 years it needed more space. So now you're looking at the gap that I was showing you in the street. This is the beginning of construction of an art storage area. This is World War II. Many New York museums were sending their collections upstate to avoid any risk of bombing. The Frick instead built a bomb shelter, 3 stories down here, which is where we stored our collection. There are many reasons why we had to take it out, and I'll show you later. This is where we're putting our new auditorium. So you may not be able to see very well in this rather faded blueprint, but this is the first of 6 comprehensive plans that the Frick has put forward to address its needs of expansion. This is by a Pittsburgh firm, Johnstone Macmillan, 1966. If you can see it, you'll see essentially that they're mirroring the 1914 Carrère and Hastings building, making it slightly larger. And the principal reason for building it was that the Frick wanted a larger auditorium to be able to have a large audience like this, or music performances, which had become hugely popular. The Frick continues to acquire the buildings. Finally, in 1972, they have acquired the 3 townhouses. But by the mid-1970s, it's a financial crisis in the United States. The Frick decides it can't afford what it had intended to build. So instead, it goes to a man named Bailey, a classical architect, who designs on one of the sites of one of the 3 townhouses this structure, which was essentially a relatively small reception hall, and in the basement of it were some seminar rooms, which the Frick later turned into exhibition spaces. And then the Frick invited Russell Page, a well-known English garden designer, to create this very beautiful garden, which, as has been referenced, caused me quite a lot of trouble when I tried to go back to the original idea of the Frick to build on this site, and instead I had to build the building that I'm working on now. So there have been 6 different projects. None of them came forward except the 2 that I've worked on. I'm just showing you one of them. This is Byra Blinder Bell, 2005. The idea was that the public could enter through the garden on 70th Street and then turn left into what was the 1977 reception hall. There would have been 2 stories on top of that, as you can see. Behind the garden is an extension of the back of the library forward. So this was one of several different projects that the Frick and 3 of my predecessors worked on, none of which went public, until most recently we went finally to the architect Annabelle Seldorf, a distinguished architect who is clearly a modernist, but has also a track record of working with historical buildings. The Neue Gallery, for example, if you know it, on Fifth Avenue in New York, happens to also be a Carrère and Hastings building of 1914, which she very judiciously added to. And so what she's doing is she's actually pulling on several of the ideas that the Frick had over the years of how to use its site. But we're ending up building only about 20,000 square feet above ground, being very careful not to overwhelm the existing site, but we're repurposing about 50,000 square feet underground, which is a lot of the project. So at a certain point, I realized we had to move out completely, lock, stock, and barrel, staff and art collection. I thought everything was going to go into storage, all the art, and find office space for the staff. But I was looking for a space within New York where we might have a temporary showing, and by luck ended up being able to negotiate the former Whitney building, which the Metropolitan Museum had leased for 8 years from the Whitney. It turned out to be perfect for us. We were able to show our entire collection and show it in a very different way. I also, at this moment, should just say that, well, the Frick it's taken the Frick 6 tries to finally get the building it wanted. Remember, the Whitney tried 5 times to build, starting in 1978 with Norman Foster going through Rem Koolhaas, up until Renzo Piano had a design. Finally, the Whitney gave up and they went downtown, and very successfully, Renzo Piano built a building down there. We couldn't move. We are tied to our site. So we had to stay and fight, and I'm glad, as Trudy said, we fought the good fight, and we now will have the building we need. But being in this building was really a kind of revelation for us and our audience. It allowed us to show our collection in a totally different way. So our great Bellini, one of the best Italian Renaissance pictures in the United States, we were able to give its own chapel-like space. We put all our great early Italian gold ground pictures in one room. Duccio Cimabue, Piero della Francesca, which all came into the collection through Helen Clay Frick, the daughter. It's very important to recognize that. She had very strong ideas, and there's some things we regret that she did, but she also happened to bring in some of the greatest works of art into the collection, and things that her father was not necessarily interested in. He did not tend towards early Italian pictures, but she did. So we have 4 Piero della Francescas, which have just come back from an exhibition in Milan, a reconstruction of an altarpiece of Piero's. These are 4 out of 7 Pieros in the United States. We have the Oni Cimabue in the United States. So it's really a distinguished collection. And we liked the power of putting all these in one room, a relatively small room. And so we are actually, when we reopen, we're going to do the same thing on the 2nd floor and put them in Helen Clay's bedroom. So there'll be a certain symbolic resonance there. So infrastructure is a very important part of what we've been doing. I'm looking from the penthouse of the library down on the skylights of the building. Looking towards Central Park, you see the skylight over the West Gallery. In the middle, you see a skylight built over in 1935 over the Garden Court. So, what could be more beautiful? But, as somebody who has to take care of it, the skylights were broken, they were leaking, the plaster was beginning to fall into the building, the velvet was fading, not to mention that the heating and air conditioning systems were on their last legs. The electricity had not been updated since 1935. I'm just saying all the things that Trudy and her colleagues have handled and have faced all the time, and so beautifully here. But correcting this was really an important part of the project. So it involved new skylights. Here you see it under construction with what's called a doghouse over. We had to erect over it so the elements wouldn't leak into the building while we were doing this. Very complicated science of lighting and glass that's really come a long way in the last decades. This is a quarter-sized reproduction of the West Gallery that we built in New Jersey, where for 2 years we could study the different kinds of glass, different kinds of lighting to prevent the kinds of rays of light we did not want to enter, to preserve the sense of natural light, which is what it's all about, but to have the light go in the right quantities in the right places. Most of the light went into the middle of the floor rather than the paintings. So we went to a lot of trouble working with conservators and scientists to achieve what we want for the future of the collection. So it's not only the preservation of the collection, but that the collection will look better than ever. We were able to do some projects, which Newport does as well, which was to replace many of the silk damasks that had either been damaged or disappeared over the years. So we went back, for instance, to Presles in Lyon, which is a house that goes back to the 18th century. They still had in their archives the loom patterns for many of our works, and they had the silk threads, which we could work to duplicate, and which eventually they could translate into modern looms, and which we've now hung back in the West Gallery. Here you see it being hung in the West Gallery. That strange plastic tube was part of the temporary heating and air conditioning system we had to put in place during all the work. We were able to do projects to repair all the plaster surrounds around the skylights, as well as conserve and clean the gilding of the supporting piers. Just to show you one other room, this is the Oval Gallery, which we didn't have all the patterns for, so we had to work from patterns that still existed and extrapolate in order to have them rewoven, also by Presles in Lyon. I think they're very beautiful, but these are sort of the original patterns. And this room, in this shaped room that was one of John Russell Pope's contributions, was intended to show our Whistler paintings, very beautiful, often monochromatic portraits, which will return here. So this is something I'm very much looking forward to. So going upstairs, up the grand staircase, this is in many ways will be the surprise for most people and kind of the heart of the project, which is to allow people finally to see the more private quarters upstairs in addition to the grander, more public rooms downstairs. And I can't point here, but so what you're seeing here is a plan of the second floor. On your left-hand side, going from the bottom to the top, that is from south to north, these were the rooms for 3 people. There were a family of 3 and servants of 27, which is roughly the proportion, I think, of Newport mansions. And so at the bottom was Adelaide's boudoir, then her bedroom, then Helen Clay's bedroom, then Henry's bedroom. The daughter separated the two, and then Henry's sitting room. And so we could never open these rooms before because we had to have elevators that were to code. So it wouldn't have been possible to do this previously, but now we are going to have these elevators, so we can open up the second floor. And I'll show you briefly what we're intending, but essentially everything that you see in orange there, a series of 11 galleries, will be new galleries open to the public. It gives us another 25% of gallery space to show our collection, which has grown considerably over the years. And I think people will go through the grand galleries as they always have. They will want to go up the great staircase, and they will have a series of new galleries, at the end of which they will probably want to walk across to these pink spaces that you see, which are, I'll show you a little bit later, which have a lobby and shop and cafe. So in the 1930s, the Frick thought about opening the second floor to the public at the time when John Russell Pope was doing his expansion. And to that end, they tore out walls, bathrooms, closets, and many of the original decorations. But in this instance, this is Adelaide's boudoir. It was decided to move it downstairs. So this is the way many of you may have known it, as it was for decades. It changed considerably in moving it down there. It lost about a quarter of its wall space. Somewhere along the line, it was painted a totally different color. In the meantime, where it had been became the director's office. So this was my office for 7 or 8 years, and one of the more beautiful offices in New York, I have to say. I gave it up so that, that we could do this project. And we have we're just in the process of returning it, where through paint analysis, we've been able to find out the original color. We've been able to restore what was missing. You can see in the mirror that there's a cabinet there, which was Duveen very cleverly built in so that he could sell more porcelain, Sèvres porcelain to Frick. So this is a room that will be filled with French 18th century furniture. Elsie de Wolfe got a commission of 10% on everything, original historical furniture she was able to sell at Frick. So there's some really good furniture in this room. So this is one of the rooms we're able to bring back. Another is the breakfast room, and this is the way it looked in a photography campaign of 1927. Fortunately, we have all the paintings, all the furniture, except the table in the middle, which is kind of an advantage because there's more room for the public to walk in. So we are recreating this room, but the fabrics long since disappeared. There were built-in bookcases. There were 5 people working in this office most recently. And so we've been able, this is a photograph I took Monday, we've been able again to go back to Lyon to reweave not only the damasks but also the curtains and the passementerie. And what I love about this is we'll be able to show the Barbizon School paintings which Frick had. These are the paintings which Frick, for the first 25 years of his collecting life, was collecting contemporary art. So it'll allow us to speak to that aspect of his collecting. In what was my closet and where I used to keep Dr. Pepper is we've created little spaces to show a Dupaquier collection given us to by the Sullivans, one of the great collections of that porcelain made in Vienna between 1725 and 1750. We are also going to be showing the collection of our late trustee Sid Knopfel, who had the greatest collection in the world of French faience, that's tin glazed earthenware produced in France from the 16th through the 18th century. So in a tribute to Sid, we're going to be showing some of his French faience. Obviously, the things I'm showing you here are not lit properly. These are just quick snapshots I took. This was Henry's bedroom, the Walnut Room. One of his favorite paintings by Romney of Lady Hamilton will be over the fireplace, and facing it will be our great Ingres, Comtesse de Sondeville. If you go across the corridor, you'll see these wonderful paintings ceiling paintings by Twachtman, probably commissioned by Elsie de Wolfe, of chinoiserie scenes. And then on the other side, in what was originally Child Frick's bedroom, we've been given by far the greatest collection in the world of commemorative medals, portrait medals from the mid-15th century through the 19th century from Steve and Janie Woucher. So we're building in cases where you can see we're just beginning to install some of these medals. So there will be new collections, new things for people to see on the second floor. I haven't mentioned the library very much, but we also had to move 400,000 volumes of off-site from the library, and you're seeing here a fresco by a Russian painter named Nicholas Lokhov, whom Helen Clay Frick commissioned to make a number of copies of Italian Renaissance paintings, this by Pietro Lorenzetti. So it was conserved, it's now being put back in the reading room. And then to the building itself, the new construction, here you see the back of the library as it comes forward towards the garden. And the lower portion is part of the 1977 reception hall that was extended around the garden by the architect Bailey. On the lower level is going to be our new education center. We never had any classrooms, period, and now we'll have a sequence of spaces for education with beautiful natural light looking onto the garden. Above that, our cafe, first time in our history we've ever had a cafe. And then above that, book and paper conservation to the left. We are, like Newport, returning trees to the garden. Lyndon Miller, who's one of the great garden designers of New York, has been working with us to bring back Russell Page's original intention to this garden. We had to remove the garden in order to excavate underneath and now bring it back. We're bringing back the gates, which were originally confronting it. And then if you're looking here at the reception hall of 1977, Annabelle Seldorfer has also tucked in a kind of conservatory above it. It's really, I think, very discreet and largely hidden from the street. This was what the interior of the reception hall looked like, which is never my favorite. I always felt it was overblown and not really in keeping with the elegance of the Frick. This is the new reception hall, which is basically double the size of the original one. The original one just got far too crowded. And Annabelle Seldorf has taken her cues from existing materials within the Frick. So the lights, for example, she designed, they're made by Seguso in Venice, but they're based on 1935 lanterns in the Frick. The marbles on the floor were also very much cued by existing marbles within the mansion. Here's the garden court, which we had to replace ley lights and skylights, and you can see some of the lanterns there that she was basing herself on. If you walk through the Frick, you're often looking at the paintings and maybe not down at your feet, but beautiful marble patterns throughout all the mansion. And so we've tended to use many of the same marbles that already existed in the house, but in new patterns, more contemporary patterns that fit the structure that Annabelle's been doing. As you see here, just a detail of the floor of the reception hall, a detail of what's going to be, I think, a very beautiful staircase. It's still under construction, so I couldn't take a shot of it that allows you to really understand it, but beautiful marbles in a kind of hanging staircase. We will, for the first time, have a dedicated exhibition space. So if we have a show of paintings, we don't have to take down the permanent collection in order to show it. This is the main gallery, and there are two other smaller galleries. This is the upper lobby, where I think people will want to come and have a respite when they've finished looking at art on the second floor. Our new museum shop will be at the end, and off to the left will be our cafe. And then underneath the 70th Street Garden, if you remember, I showed you an image of the construction of the art store that was built in 1941. We have removed that, and we're building the auditorium, which you see now nearing completion. I think it'll be quite a beautiful space, seating about 220 people with really good acoustics, which we never had. I'm not showing you all the other behind the scenes spaces like the Sherman Fairchild Conservation Center, which is 5 times larger than what they had previously. It was in a servant's room on the 3rd floor with no running water. Now it's state-of-the-art, a really beautiful conservation space. And this is the conservation space looking onto the John Russell Pope building. And I leave you with this image because it's a kind of, in a way, it sort of symbolizes the deference of our contemporary architect to the architects who came before, where she's building a new building that's very clean, it's very modern, but very respectful of John Russell Pope and what came before. So I hope you will come and see this when we finish it towards the end of the year or beginning of next year. But I hope I've piqued your interest and that you will come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wardropper.
So I know I've run over. I'm going to take your cue if we still have time for a few questions.
I think we do still have time for a few more questions. So if you would like to make your way over here, I will start off and ask you, you mentioned this is your sort of 6th iteration of a potential renovation. What is it that did not make it into this renovation that you would have liked to?
It's maybe something that only a museum director would care about, but loading dock. Previous plans had loading docks, and we just couldn't fit it in this time. So we've changed the front door, which now is disabled, accessible through a ramp, which we never had before. The transom can move. We are able to bring larger objects through that way. But, you know, I got almost everything else, but not that. No.
Very practical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. You mentioned that the collection of Italian paintings that Helen Frick brought to the museum you've kept together in the new iteration. I wondered, were there any other elements from your Frick-Madison experience that changed your plans for the new Frick when it opens next year?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I mean, I think that's maybe the most obvious one to me. We're very mindful of the fact that people love our galleries as they are on the first floor. We're not going to make major changes, but another change is we did this wonderful room of porcelain, mostly Meissen porcelain, and we will be doing more of that. You know, for example, I showed you the French faience. And one of the things the Frick can do that some museums can't is we can put things out without protective barriers in front of it. It preserves the sense of it being a private collection, but you can really get close and see objects. And so we loved what was happening with some of those installations, such as the porcelain that we put all together in one room. We put all of our bronzes, Renaissance bronzes, together in one room, so the metals cabinet sort of picks up on that. So there are aspects of that we have learned from and will bring through.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, thanks so much for your wonderful talk. I'm a guide here at the Preservation Society, and I'm always curious to know how you're going to label things, because people sometimes ask us why we don't have lots of labels on things, and I always say, well, it's supposed to look like a house, and it would interfere with this sort of aesthetic. So I'm wondering if you're doing any, or are you having any audio guides, or what kind of...
It's a really key question, an important question. And so when we moved into Frick-Madison, we had big debates. Should we now have labels? And in the end, we decided not to. We wanted to really ask the public to look first, and then if they had questions, I think it's our responsibility to find different means of answering it. So one of the things that we did successfully in Frick-Madison was we were the guinea pig for Bloomberg Philanthropies that started a new a program called Bloomberg Connects, which was app-based, and we had an app already. We worked with them to sort of test things out. And so fortunately, we were able to completely redo our audio guide, 160 stops, in time for reopening Frick Madison. And it was important because at that point in the pandemic, we couldn't hand out audio machines because people still were afraid of touch communicating the disease. So in this way, people could use their iPhones and plug in the information and find the information they wanted. So we will not be using labels for the most part. We've decided to keep with that. We really like the way that our public is asked to look first, and we will have more educational programs, we'll have more tours, we'll have more audio tours, we have professional docents who lecture for us, and so I feel comfortable with that. But you mentioned already that one of the reasons Newport doesn't have labels is to preserve the sense of this being a private house, and I think that's really important. At the same time, we do want to give new information, and publications is one. I'm very proud of our publications. We've got 4 new books will be coming out at the time we reopen. So it's something we think about very much, how to communicate information.
Thank you so much, and I think we're all looking forward to visiting the Frick when it reopens. At this point, I would like to invite everyone out to the terrace, and thank you once more, Mr. Wardropper.
Thank you.